Welcome, everyone. I'm Rabbi Arnie Gluck. I'm the rabbi here at Temple Bethel, and we're delighted to have all of you and to host this event. It's the first of what we hope will be an ongoing partnership with the Network for Responsible Public Policy. Among the values that we hold dear here in this synagogue is to try to have strong civic engagement, a commitment to repairing the world, and in a very partisan, very divided, very politically rancorous world, it seems that there's a lot of heat and very little light. So the opportunity to join together with the Network for Responsible Public Policy to try to create civic understanding and engagement and nonpartisan efforts to achieve understanding of critical and important policy issues spoke to us very much. So it was a delight to meet and get to know Rhoda Sherman, who's the president of the network, and it's my joy to introduce her now, to invite her to introduce our program. Thank you.
So after that wonderful introduction, thank you so much, Rabbi. It's been just a great experience working with the Rabbi in Temple Bethel, and I thank you so much, and we do look forward to a good future together, bringing wonderful programs to all of you on the important issues of our time. I also want to thank my friend Lisa Cohn, Liz Cohn, oh my God, from the Reformed Jewish Voice of New Jersey. I promised I'd remember that, and I didn't. I apologize, but I want to thank you so much because she's been incredibly helpful. So, we're thrilled to be here, and as the rabbi said, this is our first program, and we're looking forward to the future. But I get the sense that there's not too many of you here who are familiar with the network. Am I correct? Raise your hand, you. We have one person who I know is familiar. Yeah, so I'm going to urge you to go to our website. It's nfrpp.org, and there you will see that we're nonpartisan, we're nonprofit, and we bring amazing programs to the general public. We're trying to educate and inform, we're trying to combat misleading information, and in this horrible political environment, even fake information. So keep tuned to us. We bring all kinds of programs on all kinds of issues to various locations in New Jersey. And tonight is an example of that kind of program, excuse me, with our two terrific speakers who I'm going to introduce to you right now. Now, where's my introductions? Yeah. So our first speaker is going to be John Grombach-Tedesco, and John is the Associate Professor and Convener of American Studies at Ramapo College in New Jersey. He is the author of Cuba, the United States, and the Cultures of Transnational Left, and co-editor of Screening Images of American Masculinity in the Age of Post-Feminism. He is a prolific writer whose work has appeared in American Quarterly, Journal of Latin American Studies, Washington Post, Journal of Social Philosophy, and more. His doctorate degree from University of Texas in Austin is in American Studies. And he'll be followed by Hannah Siegel. Hannah is the managing director of New American Economy, which is a bipartisan coalition of business, civic, and cultural leaders in all 50 states. They are dedicated to making a case for smart, sensible immigration reform. Hannah has been an associate producer for ABC News, World News, and part of their investigative unit. She has a master's degree in public policy from Harvard Kennedy School of Government and a Bachelor of Arts from Duke University. So I just want to mention that after the presentations by our two speakers, we'll open it to a Q&A. And it's my experience that you'll all have lots of questions. So I'm going to ask that those of you that want to make a statement kind of limit it, make it short so that everybody has a chance, and I'll leave that judgment call to all of you. So having said that, John, the podium is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? With good volume? Okay. Well, thank you, Rhoda, for that generous introduction, and thank you all for being here. As Rhoda said, this is an important topic, certainly one that is timely. I'm an American Studies and History professor at Ramapo College of New Jersey, and I teach a class specifically focused on immigration to the United States, and it's a class that I think has gotten more popular, certainly in the last couple of years, as students are very interested in the headlines that they read when they read headlines, and are curious about their own immigration backgrounds. I mean, we live in a very interesting part of the country. It's a part of the country that's full of immigrants, and many of us have these stories that help ground our identities. And so I find in the class it's wonderfully personal as well as historical. And I'd like to share some of the things that we talk about just a bit over a semester with you, thinking about the history of U.S. immigration, and then connect it to our contemporary landscape, our contemporary political landscape, which is what a forum such as this is so good at doing. Trying to engage ourselves civically as a community to arrive at different truths through debate, and discussion, and so I hope that this helps us do that. And again, thank you for being here. Well, you know, if we kind of think about, you know, sort of thinking about history of American immigration in broad strokes, we have to be cognizant of the fact that immigration is unique in the United States, and that is very formative of our national identity. So the U.S. isn't exceptional in terms of having immigration conflict, a history of immigration. All modern nations politically grapple with the topic of immigration. But what's unique in the United States is that it is formative to our national identity. We have this part of the narrative of the American dream, and overwhelmingly, most of us, come from immigrant backgrounds. You know, between 1 and 1.5% of the United States population claims indigenous identity, right, Native American. So that means, you know, 98 to 98.5% of us have an immigrant story in our pasts. Yet, there is an anxiety around this narrative. So this is kind of one of the paradoxes of immigration in the United States. There's an anxiety about otherness, and we have periods of xenophobia, fear of other groups, as well as nativism, that ebb and flow throughout U.S. history, but they don't remain constant. There are times when our border is very open. There's actually a time when our border is non-existent. And when we do get a border, it is very open, and then it closes for certain reasons, political reasons, economic reasons. So what we face today, especially since the election in 2016, isn't wholly unique in our history. We do have these kinds of debates, you know, going back to the 18th century. But what makes it particularly frustrating, I think, for most Americans is that we don't know how to reconcile this anxiety with the very triumphal part of this history, one which we identify with ourselves, and one, again, which becomes the basis of our national formation, this American dream kind of idea. Well, so some brief, I promise, brief history. By and large, if you look at, you know, most of U.S. history, immigrants come pretty much without restriction. You know, one constant throughout U.S. history is population growth. You know, we began with the first census in 1790 with 4 million people. By 1860, there are 31.5 million, and today we have roughly 327 million people in the United States. For much of that history, the border is pretty much open, and there's very little restriction for people coming to the United States. But things change, and things change really by the end of the 19th century. It's a very interesting period in American history because it's when the United States begins globalizing in a meaningful way. And it's globalizing by expanding outward through things like the Spanish-American War, but also economically, finding new markets, interest in East Asia. And so America is trying to compete with colonial powers in Europe and thinking about itself in a new global context as it really hadn't prior. It's not that the United States was never international, it was that more Americans, as part of their nationalism, began conceiving themselves as sort of global citizens. And that is something that's very readily apparent to us today, but it was sort of taking shape in the late 19th century. The other part of that, of course, is immigrants. Immigration skyrockets in the late 19th century due to an industrial boom, a post-Civil War America that demands labor and allows people willing to do that labor to come in. It's an interesting time also conceptually when we're talking about national identity. Greg Grandin, who's a historian at NYU, New York University, has made the argument that it's at this time when the frontier becomes a border. So through much of the 19th century, and you may remember from your history classes, we had this thing that is often called manifest destiny. This idea that as the United States grows and moves west, with that comes a kind of industrializing spirit. Freedom, we have this association of going west with freedom and opportunity. Well, towards the end of the 19th century, when the frontier effectively is closed, we've expanded west, the United States government is no longer at war with most Native American communities by the end of the 19th century, there becomes then a concern with territorial sovereignty. That is, where do we begin and where do we end? And how do we protect what we have? So we have, as I mentioned, these kind of twin vectors working. We have expanding out, what we might call the beginnings of American empire or the continuation of American empire, as well as immigrants coming in, all right, these kind of two vectors. There's a push for this kind of cosmopolitanism, a modernity, right, an American globality, right, to be of the world, in the world, but of the world, but also to have the world in our nation. There is, though, this simultaneous anxiety around otherness. It's not perhaps accidental that as we have between 1880 and 1924, some 27 million people are coming to the United States on the average of 900,000 a year. And those are the people who are counted, right? I mean, it's impossible to know how many people are able to come into the United States, particularly through the southern border, which is not militarized and which really isn't even sort of protected in any kind of way until the early part of the 20th century. What also is happening at this time is a serious concern about aptitude and fitness of those people coming in. This is when race science, the science of race, what will later be called eugenics in the early 20th century, really begins to become popular in not just the upper echelons of universities like Harvard, Yale, Cambridge, Oxford, but also in popular consciousness. So these questions are now part of the headlines as well as academic journals. Who are we letting in, and what is their biological fitness, right? What is their stock, right? What we call race or blood. And this is really important because it becomes the basis for justifications of exclusion. World War I is another really key point because World War I is an avalanche of humanitarian disaster, and it's one of the first times, at least in the 20th century, where you have lots of people who are suddenly stateless. You have the movement and displacement of people. You have the breaking up of empires. You have the creation of new nation states, and you have many people who are forced to basically have new nations and new national identities. With that is the question of territorial sovereignty. And so it's after World War I when the United States begins putting into place laws as well as an administration and a police system, military system, to create and surveil, police, and protect the border. That's really a kind of late 19th century, early 20th century construction, creation, the border. These changes come out of the war. These are major questions that weren't there in 1850. Okay, they're here in 1920. How do we enforce restriction? Whom are we going to exclude, and how do we enforce this? How do we maintain our territorial sovereignty? Right? A border helps do that. It helps define where we are and how we can remain sovereign. This question, do illegal aliens, or what we might say today are undocumented people, do aliens have rights, right? Are people who come into this country without proper paperwork, do they have constitutional guarantees? This is still a question that is pressing in 2019. To what degree do people have any sort of rights in Texas, in Arizona, in Southern California? The 1920s also, and I think this is something that we don't often talk about in public discussions about immigration today, we begin deporting large numbers of people, but not until the 1920s. And really, those large numbers don't exist until after 2000, when we're talking large numbers. There were just a few hundred people deported a year, maybe. Most of those people were in different forms of state incarceration. Maybe they were mental institutions, maybe they were, after World War I, they were radicals, they were subversives. But really, the statistics are, a few hundred a year, and to roughly 40,000 people are deported in 1929. In the last couple years of Obama's administration, as you'll see here in a moment in the graph, there was upwards between 400 and 450,000 people deported. They were removed, actually. We no longer use the term deportation. We use the legal term is removal. So it's not that we were created in 1776, we've always had a border, and we've always accepted certain people and deported many people. Deportation is a 20th century invention, and it has political meaning. If you can deport people, right, if you can exclude people, you are also thinking about who's removable. Right? So those who are excludable can also be removable. And remember, deportation and exclusion is also a conversation about what makes citizenship, right? Who's here and how do we demarcate our citizenship? We do that in part by demarcating who needs to leave or who can't be here. So this is kind of a new era of American gatekeeping. This is probably a familiar space to many of you. We have now this border, and in fact, the creation of Ellis Island was precisely out of a kind of racial science background. We wanted a place to be able to bring immigrants in that was not on the mainland, right? To be able to medically assess them and contain them before we let them into the United States, to New York proper. But what's interesting about this period, if you've been to Ellis Island, who's been to Ellis Island, right? Everyone's gone to Ellis Island. Go there, and then there's the big medical examination area. And they show you all these kind of scary instruments, and they say people had to submit to this, and they were determined whether they could enter or not. Immigration historians believe that during this time, maybe 1% of those coming through Ellis Island were rejected. Maybe 1%. Overwhelmingly, the people that showed up were accepted. Of those people were Italians, were Hindus, South Asian Indians, we would say today, Russians. This is actually a really wonderful photographer, if you don't know his work, Augustus Sherman, who took a lot of pictures at Ellis Island of immigrants from the early 20th century. Another one would be Louis Hine. We've got these wonderful images of these, and just hundreds of images under his corpus, Augustus Sherman. But we also don't want to forget the other coast. What I try to teach in my classes too often, especially in New Jersey, in this part of the country, we tend to foreground Ellis Island, which is also foregrounding America's immigration as a European story. right? But it's not. It's also an Asian story, and just as there's an Ellis Island, there's an Angel Island, where a similar sort of taxonomy of medical analysis and test for fitness, right? That biological fitness before you could enter the country. And of course, early, this would be a kind of rudimentary southern border of El Paso. El Paso becomes really important after 1905 because of train technology, the railroad. We're able to have commerce between Mexico and the United States through the use of train after 1905. Well, people come, and then they are, as we do in the United States, especially in urban areas, we sort of ghettoize ourselves through races and ethnicities and language groups. And so if you look at this map from 1910, this is a picture of Newark as it was envisioned ethnically, racially. We have Germans, Jews, Greeks, Irish, Negroes, Italians, different sections of town. And of course, the American urban landscape looks much like this over different parts of the country. Asians coming to the West Coast after 1898, many of those, Japanese, Korean, Filipino, were coming through Hawaii, because Hawaii was, after 1898, a U.S. territory, so there was a legal avenue for Asians to come through Hawaii. Already California and the West Coast had, by 1910, 1915, roughly 60,000 people of Chinese origin. So you've got this kind of multi-Asian population, mostly in the West, although certainly some in the East as well. You see this picture here on the left. This is Japanese farmers in Hawaii cheering the emperor's birthday in 1916. So it shows that there's a strong Japanese heritage even after Hawaii's become a U.S. territory. Strong Japanese celebrations. So many of these people are able to come to the mainland United States through Hawaii. Punjabi Sikhs, South Asian Indian Sikhs, S-I-K-H, early 20th century here building the railroad, as did many Asian nationals, the Chinese especially, in the 1860s. Significant percentage of the railroad labor force in the West was Chinese. Well, with the opening and letting many different groups in, we of course also have removal and exclusion. And if you were to take my class, you would learn that different ethnic groups, different racial groups have to face stereotypes and different forms of violence by making their way into American citizenship. The Irish of the 1860s and 1870s, there was a lot of racism against the Irish. The Chinese, the Chinese, it's an interesting story because the Chinese become the first ethnicity, China becomes the first nation where we restrict immigration categorically with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So with those thousands of Chinese workers that were building the railroad, there was also a response to that by white native workers who did not like Chinese workers taking their jobs or taking their jobs when there was a strike. And so they lobbied the Western states, and this lobbying made its way to Congress in Washington, and that produced the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. And what's interesting about that act is it focuses on the Chinese, but it becomes a blueprint for exclusion. After 1882, now there's a language for exclusion and a way to do it, a logic that will apply to other groups into the 20th century. See just headlines here. This is South Asian Indians kicked out of a town in California. This is, you probably can't read that sign that says positively no Filipinos allowed. So all of this is before the 1964 Civil Rights Act, of course. So there's the race, stock kind of thing, and there's also the political agitators, as they were called, right? Agitators, radicals, undesirables, right? So especially after World War I, you have a concern with political radicalism. People who were socialist, after 1917. Communists, anarchists were increasingly connected to immigrants. And people like Emma Goldman, right, a Russian emigre, anarchist, probably one of the most famous political thinkers and speakers in the United States in the early 20th century, had a huge following. She would be deported after 1917 for her activism. You've got two political cartoons here. The one on the left is from the Baltimore American. The one on the right is from the Chicago Tribune. It's a very different political different political narrative on the right than maybe Chicago might give you today, given the recent mayoral election. But on the left, it says the bomberang. So you see a person throwing a bomb at the American flag. He's got the word anarchy on his lapel. But surprise, it's a bomberang. So it's a bomb, but it's a boomerang, and so it's going to come back and knock him over. And it's even got a little bit of like Lady Liberty here. On the right, you've got just a cartoon that says, "Close the gate." Okay, it's a person with a bomb for a head. He's carrying baggage that says "undesirable." That gate would be something that more people were thinking about around the time of World War I. So eugenics, the politics, the political identity of immigrants, but also this eugenics, which was pervasive, right, and would really influence a lot of policy around immigration around the 19-teens and 1920s. Increasingly, there was concern for regulating the population, the American population. That would be biology, race, which at this time was still interchangeable with national origin. So if you looked at, say, a census or talked about racial identity in the early 20th century, we talked about it often in terms of nations. This is before we used the word ethnicity like we do today. We tend to think of people grouped as races, but also ethnicities within those races. In 1906, 1910, one would be of the Chinese race, or of the Irish race, or of different Teutonic Anglo-Saxon races. And so sometimes they had national equivalencies. So there were equivalencies between nations and races. So after the Chinese Exclusion Act, these again are just images from this period I'm talking about, you had people of Chinese origin required to carry identification that said they could be in the United States. This happened after actually 1892 when this Exclusion Act was renewed. It was called the Geary Act. On the right, you see a cartoon from the 1906 Naturalization Act, which instituted literacy as a requirement to become a U.S. citizen. The 1906 Naturalization Act also moved naturalization, the process of becoming a citizen, from jurisdiction of the states to federal jurisdiction. So now it's a federal matter. Before, you petitioned the state you lived in to become a U.S. citizen. After 1906, the federal government had much more control over that naturalization process. These kinds of trends would factor into sweeping immigration acts. First one of 1917, and then another one 7 years later. This happens during World War I, overriding, incidentally, President Woodrow Wilson's veto. This act now widened the list of undesirables that could not come into the United States, and if they were in here, they could be removed or deported. Who were some of these people? Well, the list is long, but it reads right out of eugenics literature: alcoholics, anarchists, criminals, convicts, epileptics, feeble-minded persons, idiots, illiterates, imbeciles, insane persons, paupers, persons with constitutional psychopathic inferiority. This would be read as homosexuals, because homosexuality was seen as a psychological illness. That's language for homosexuals in 1917 language. Literacy was still required. It also effectively barred many Asian countries. There were some exceptions. The Philippines was a U.S. territory after 1898, a colony of, and so Filipinos could come. There were some Asian nationals that could still come through Hawaii, but by and large, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, many Middle Eastern, what we would call Middle East today, and Central Asian and South Asian nationalities were barred from immigrating to the United States. That was even more formalized 7 years later in the Immigration Act in 1924. This is the Johnson-Reed Act. It capped the number of total immigrants admissible to the United States at 155,000. So we were averaging some years 800,000 to 900,000 immigrants a year, and that plummets to 155,000 after 1924. That number was based, so how many of which nations? The number of, say, Italians or Poles or French that could come to the United States was based on the 1890 census. 2% of that number was now the admissible number that could come after 1924. There were no restrictions for countries in the Western Hemisphere, so the Americas. But this meant that, Italian immigration, for instance, fell 90% after 1924. This act also effectively created the consular system and a border. This is when we get a border patrol after 1924. This is when visas and passports become standard fare for coming into the United States. Not that that paperwork did not exist before 1924, but it was much more formalized. And so you see from this graph that the number of immigrants coming to the United States plummets from 1820, and we're right here about 1924. These are by decades. And the number goes down quite a bit. Deportations are also a part of this. The deportations rise. So I think that one of the important things to think about, and something that I don't think we talk about enough today, is the way that regulating immigration is also a way, historically, but also today, is a way to regulate the nation's biology. Right? By regulating the nation's biology, you can regulate the racial makeup of the nation. And this certainly goes against at least the stated narratives of American liberalism, right? Especially since the civil rights movement of the 1950s, right? That we are a country that is plural, we pride ourselves on diversity, certainly in the area of race. Immigration policy affects the biological makeup of the nation, right? Naturalization laws, who can naturalize, who's excluded. I don't have time today, but there is a long history of certain groups such as South Asian Indians or Japanese not being able to become U.S. citizens. I mean, the Supreme Court between the 1870s and 1950s had to rule on certain groups of people, whether they could be admitted as citizens, whether they could naturalize, because the first Naturalization Act in the United States in 1790 stated that one had to be white to get U.S. citizenship. Okay. In 1870, after the Civil War, there are now 4 million slaves who are freed. African Americans do not have citizenship, so the United States needs to figure out a way of how to give citizenship to free African Americans. They changed the naturalization law. So they changed it in 1870 to say you have to be white to become a U.S. citizen, or you have to be someone of African origin. Well, okay, so if you're Japanese, what do you do? If you're South Asian Indian, or if you're Filipino, and so effectively the Supreme Court rules between 1870 and 1950, because race-based naturalization laws don't go away till 1952. The Supreme Court, therefore, is tasked with answering the question, is someone who's Japanese white? Is someone who is South Asian Indian white? And so there's a really interesting history that I won't go into, but I'm certainly happy to answer questions about what they say. So that regulates, right, the biology of the nation. Another big history in this, of course, is women. women are not granted their own nationality, their own rights to citizenship, independent of their husbands until the 1940s. That means if you're an American woman and you marry someone between 1907 and there's a law in 1922, but 1907 and 1940, if you marry someone who's ineligible for citizenship, your citizenship is taken away from you. You, in effect, are denationalized. So not only can the federal government, after the 1920s, denaturalize people, so if people become U.S. citizens, this is kind of what's happening with some increased frequency today. If you become a U.S. citizen under fraudulent pretenses, or the government determines that it's fraudulent, then you can have your citizenship taken away from you. If you are an American citizen, right, and you say an American woman, and you marry someone ineligible for citizenship, and your citizenship is taken away from you, you're not denaturalized, you're denationalized. Your nation is taken from you. So why does that affect biology? Well, you know, if you're a white woman in California and a Chinese man cannot become a citizen, it's a disincentive to marry and make children with that Chinese man, right? You're literally changing the race of the nation through these laws. The other part of eugenics, a tragic part that the nation is still grappling with today, different states are doing a lot of work with this, is compulsory sterilization. Sterilizing people deemed unfit, right, which happened in huge numbers. All states, I believe all states had sterilization laws on the books. So the important part of this is that the nation can control its racial makeup, its biology. And so one of the interesting questions I think we need to ask is, like, what might the country look like today without race-based and nation-based exclusions? Like, if we think about our diversity, our racial makeup, we think of New Jersey, we think of California. I mean, if you take away, and this has been a very abbreviated history of this, if you take that away, what might the country look like physically, you know, racially, ethnically? We might think that this is only history and we're no longer doing this. I think this kind of conversation has implication for contemporary policy, like the 7-nation ban that has currently been held up by the executive order by President Trump that's currently being held up in the courts, or the 30,000 a year refugee cap that is happening this year. So, you know, after the 1980 Refugee Act, most presidents allowed at least 50,000, at least, refugees into the United States, and that number has been lowered. And when you look where many of these refugees are coming from, that is changing radically the racial makeup. I mean, there's a biological component to this. Right? Well, things change after 1965. The Cold War is on, but so is the Civil Rights era. And so Lyndon Johnson, as president, who's got his Great Society, agrees to with his Congress that we need to rethink our immigration. And so this is when we do away with race-based and nation-based exclusions, and we go to a 20,000 person at this time from all countries. 20,000 people are admitted. We also go to family unification laws in our immigration. So now you can invite spouses, you can invite family members. We also open our different work visas. We start now saying that immigrants that have certain skills, well, we need them in this nation. So the number of immigrants go up and the type of immigrants change. This is when a lot more Asian immigrants come to the United States. If you see in 1960, the top 10 largest immigrant groups. In 1960 on the left, on the right are those from 2013. You get a lot of Central American, Latin American, and of course, Asian. There's one more, the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act. This was bipartisan, signed by Ronald Reagan, that basically gave a path to asylum for some 3 million immigrants, but it also imposed tighter control over hiring of undocumented undocumented people. So this is immigration. This is to connect us to immigration today, and I know Hannah will talk much more about this in detail about our landscape today. But if you look at illegal alien removals since 1990 to 2013, you see the steady growth of people being deported, being removed from the United States, and there's a lot of reasons for that. There's certainly a change in illegal immigration in the 1990s. 9/11 certainly plays a big role in that escalation of removals. But I think it's striking to see that under Obama, his 2 terms were removed. I believe the statistic is the same. More people were removed from the United States under Obama than previous 19 presidents combined. Of course, he uses his executive authority to also give asylum to large numbers of immigrants as well. If we look at 2017 and 18 here, we haven't reached those numbers. So we're at about 250,000 or so last year were removed. I think it's interesting to think about what this means for the nation. If you can see these numbers, you see from on the left 1900, on the right is 2060. So these are predictions of the percentage of people in the country who will be foreign born. So today there's roughly 46 million people or so who are foreign born, right? They weren't born in the United States. They live in the United States, but they're foreign born, which is roughly 15 to 16% of the national population. And what's interesting to see, I think, is that the last time that same percentage held was around World War I. So it's an interesting question to ask. Not that history simply repeats itself. That I never really believed that. But there is a question: is there a percentage of foreign-born people in the nation when it becomes that brings to the foreground then an anxiety? That is historical, right? It was part of what I'm trying to show. It's not the same anxiety. It's not the same. It's not on the same terms. But I don't think it's accidental that 14 to 15% of the nation today is foreign-born, and the last time it was that, the nation responded with really restrictive legislation. The future is really interesting. According to this projection by the Census Bureau, upwards towards 19% by 2060 will be, so almost 1 in 5 will be foreign-born in the United States. Of course, that's impossible to know, right? Because what this depends upon is legislation, laws, right? Whom we let in, how many we let in, and so that's just based on history and sort of our current era, but it's really impossible to know. Today we have what the Custom and Border Protection Commissioner Kevin McCallinen has called a breaking point. Okay, a breaking point. March, just this past March, saw 100,000 migrant apprehensions this month, or in March, 90% due to illegal border crossings. This is the highest month total of apprehensions since 2008. If you look at length of detention, 48% of people who are in immigrant detention are there from 2 to 4 years. So this is one of the things that needs our attention, is the question, what are the rights of people who are detained? Yeah.
Is that number of 100,000 include those who present themselves seeking asylum, which would be questionable legal border crossings?
Yeah, so you have to get across and then seek asylum. I think, and this might be a policy question, but my understanding is that one is still labeled as an illegal crossing even if they're seeking asylum, but the asylum then is a different avenue of paperwork. So you can still...
I'm sure that number does include asylum seekers. You can either present yourself at the border, seek asylum, or cross illegally and seek asylum. Either way, I think that does count.
40,000 children are in Customs and Border Protection custody. And this, again, is the commissioner saying that these are overwhelming numbers for ICE and the Department of Health and Human Services. These people, incidentally, who run these agencies are losing their jobs quickly. And it's a humanitarian crisis, right? And it really brings the question of like international law, right? How is what the United States is doing in concert with like the United Nations, right? It is people in cages and trying to figure out if we're going to make that 650 miles more. This was not there in 1920, though. I mean, if there were fences, it was mostly to keep cattle out of the United States because of tick-borne illnesses. That's why there were fences. I think another thing that we need to dispel is the myth that our borders being overrun by people, right? There's just millions of, sometimes, depending on whom you listen to or what you read, we're being told that millions of people are coming in, there is no control, but actually if you look at border apprehensions, they have plummeted in the last few years. In case you're wondering what this looks like. So do people want this wall? Well, if you ask them in 2017, of course there's all kinds of different polls, but in 2017, it showed this. The question was, do you favor or oppose building a wall along the U.S.-Mexico border to try to stop illegal immigration? Opposed is the black line above. The green line is favor. It's interesting also, this is the election, right, November 2016. These things can change month to month. Certainly the election, this was a prominent, this is how Donald Trump became President Trump, using immigration in terms of a security issue and an economic issue. So really using two huge concerns of the American public, security and jobs, economics, and being able to fasten both of those to one person and one really type of body, the immigrant body. And race, right, the immigrant, and I was going to say the brown immigrant body. We're not talking about, right, yeah, no, I was, exactly. It's not the Irish people, it's the brown bodies that are threatening. And that has a history, which I hope I've shown. That's not new to the 21st century. There's a history. The bodies change, but the discourse of pathology, right, the biological pathogen or the social pathogen that threatens a violence to an otherwise stable entity, the nation, of course, directs our attention to that. Last slide, which this is bad slide making 101. This should say building a wall along U.S.-Mexico border. This is not Swedish with English in between. This is idling a wall. No, it's building a wall along the U.S.-Mexico border. So this is a CBS News poll from March 2018, and you see that the numbers are pretty pronounced. So opposed is light blue, and in favor is purple. And you see that among Republicans, Democrats, this is unsurprising. There's a switch, but I think it's interesting to show that Democrats seem, according to this poll, the Democrats that are polled here are more against the wall than Republicans are for it in this dimension. Independents are 61, opposed 36. This is according to, again, just one poll from CBS. Okay, that's going to end my portion because I want to give Hannah ample time to talk, but I'm happy to answer questions as we go into the Q&A. All right, thank you. Okay, I'll get out of your way.
Okay, bear with me for just a second while I see if I can pull up my slides. Here we go. Let's see. Here we go. That was excellent. Thank you so much. And a really good lead into what I'm going to talk about. So thank you so much, Rhoda, for having me. I really appreciate it. My grandma's so excited that I'm at Temple. I can't tell you. She's like, you're not only going to Temple, but you're speaking at Temple, just in time for Passover at her house. So thank you for inviting me very much. As Rhoda said, my name's Hannah Siegel. I'm the managing director at an organization called New American Economy. And I want to do a few things with the time that we have before Q&A, building off of John's presentation, talk a little bit about what the immigration debate is right now and what I think it should be in order to pave the way for real change, which we really haven't had in the immigration system since that Lyndon Johnson 1965 bill, which was a long time ago. Second, I want to tell you a little bit about New American Economy, which I'm assuming most of you aren't familiar with, and what we're doing to fight for better immigration laws and to change the way that people think about immigrants in America. I'll talk a little bit about the politics of the issue, which are dominant right now, of course. And finally, just talk a little bit about what each of you can do. I don't mean for this to sound trite, but your voices really, really matter. I spend a huge amount of time with lawmakers, and they never want to hear from me. They only want to hear from their voters. And so there's actually a lot that you can do. Change starts in rooms like these. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But first I want to talk about what the immigration debate is right now, which is what it's been for a long time, a screaming match between the two bases. So it's a base issue. It's an issue that each side, Democrats and Republicans, use to gin up their base. And on the left, in some form, it's usually a conversation about human rights, about the plight of the undocumented. On the right, it's a conversation about national security and law and order. Both of those are really important conversations, but I think if we've learned anything from the past literally almost 60 years, it's that they don't lead to change. Those are conversations that happen in silos over here. And I'm sure you see this in your own community. You're in a community that's vibrant and diverse, and I'm sure you see challenges as well on the ground, but it's much more complicated than the debate you hear at the national level, particularly right now. And so despite the fact that everyone agrees the immigration system is broken, we've basically made zero progress in fixing it for the last 50 years. And that's why New American Economy was formed. So our theory of change is that the humanitarian case, while important, really only works for one set of people, and the law and order case works only for another set of people, and we need arguments that can work for both. So we decided to start with the economic ones in 2010, which is when we were formed. So in New York City, where I live, where John lives, almost half of our businesses were founded by immigrants. We get 50 million tourists a year because we are a diverse, exciting place. So immigration is really central to the economic success and the cultural success of New York City. And of course that's true here too. You all might know this, but statewide in New Jersey has about 22.8% of its population are immigrants. It's actually the fifth most immigrant-heavy state in the country, only behind California, Texas, New York, and Florida, which is very impressive. And statewide, immigrants pay $24 billion in taxes, started 120,000 businesses, employed 400,000 jobs. This is just in 1 year, 2017. And then you can see we're in the 7th congressional district right now, I believe, and so you can see some of those numbers for your district down below. So the theory behind NAE is not, as I said, that the humanitarian or security arguments aren't important. It's that by making the economic arguments first, you can localize this issue, you can quantify exactly why it matters in your neighborhood, and then you can pave the way for those harder conversations and eventually, hopefully, help create better policy. So, in a way, this message has worked to some extent. Just not very long ago. So I said we were formed in 2010. This is a poll that Pew does every single year, asking people, do immigrants strengthen or burden the country? And so you can see, so the gray line is millennials and how they have progressed. The green line is do immigrants strengthen the country? The black line is, do they burden the country? And so you can see it was about evenly split every single year from 2001, post 9/11, to 2010, and then it started to split. And I love this slide so much because it makes us look so good. We happen to be formed in 2010 on the theory that the economic case could help us move the debate, but actually, you know, we and some other groups have tried to bring this to the forefront. And I mean, the economic case for immigration has been strong and around for a long time, but it's lived in academic journals mostly until somewhat recent years, when we and some others have tried to bring it into the debate as a way of bringing multiple sides to the table at once. And so we have made some progress, and for millennials, it's almost 80% who believe that immigrants strengthen the country. So while more and more Americans understand that immigrants are a part of American success, there's a small group that vehemently disagrees, and they've gotten louder and louder over the past few years, and they've also gained a platform in the White House that has brought that conversation from the very fringes of the debate really to the center. And for them, immigration is really an existential threat, and as John pointed out, there's a lot of history to where that comes from. So, you know, what we've realized as an advocacy group and as a movement is that convincing the majority of Americans only matters if they speak up. And mostly, I travel all around the country, actually mostly in red, more conservative areas than New Jersey and New York, talking to lawmakers and people on the ground. And I actually don't have to do a huge amount of convincing that immigrants are good, but there is so much wrapped up into this issue that it's a more complicated conversation. And even for people who are sympathetic to this cause to some extent, they're not engaged on it, and there are a lot of causes out there that are worth fighting for right now. If you are anti-immigrant, for most people who are, that I've come into contact with, it's your number one cause. You're voting on it, you're active on it, this is what you care about, and that matters. That group is mobilized, they're organized, and so they have an outsized voice, particularly right now for obvious reasons, in the debate. So, you know, what would a better immigration system look like, and how should we think about that? We know what the problems with our immigration system are broadly, and this isn't to trivialize the policy discussions, but actually for quite a while, there has been a basic understanding of what a framework for a better immigration system would look like, because we know that we basically have a few big problems. The first is that we have 11 million undocumented people living here without status. There is no line for them to get in. There is no system that they could jump into as a means to becoming a citizen or gaining legal status for the most part. They are just living in a purgatory with no way to adjust. And so that is obviously untenable and has created a second class of citizens that doesn't make any sense and is inhumane to some extent. We have huge problems at the border that John alluded to, and that I can talk about later if you want. We also, you know, in addition to the humanitarian crisis at the border and the fact that the system isn't set up, I think what's manifesting right now is that we don't have a system that's set up to receive a huge amount of vulnerable migrants. So historically, migrants that have come to the border have been, or in somewhat recent history, have been single men coming to work. And recently, it's been more families, unaccompanied minors, and asylum seekers. And that's what our system is really unprepared to manage. But we also don't know who's coming and who's going. I mean, the debate over whether our border is secure is complicated, but much like the rest of our immigration system, we really don't know who's coming or going. A huge amount of the undocumented population who lives in this country today came legally and overstayed their visas, which is a different picture than what a lot of people think. And so when we think about comprehensive immigration reform, which is what New American Economy ultimately is trying to achieve, that includes rethinking border security, because we don't think that a wall solves any of the problems, but we do need to have a better way to know who's coming or going in order to have a functioning system. And then we have an antiquated visa system that just doesn't match the modern economy. I mean, anything that was formed in 1965 is basically irrelevant now. That includes the immigration system. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But those are the three buckets of what comprehensive immigration reform needs to tackle. So a vast majority of immigrants come here to work, which is what has made immigration America's great competitive advantage. And we have this national narrative, generation after generation. We have young, hardworking people with diverse skill sets who flood our shores, and our economy has really thrived because of it. So this is actually the first thing that we did as an organization. We put out a report in 2011 looking at Fortune 500 companies and how many of them were founded by immigrants or their children. And this, coming back to our theory of change, was really about framing this issue in a way that different kinds of people of all stripes, of all ideologies, could understand immediately. So we come out with this stat every year. Last year, we haven't done it for 2019 yet, but for 2018, it was 44% of Fortune 500 companies were founded by immigrants or their children. And in a lot of ways, I mean, immigrants are more likely to be entrepreneurs statistically, and it sort of makes sense. For a lot of immigrants who come here, you don't have a network, you don't have a lot of family here, you don't have other avenues to find jobs in existing companies, and so you start a restaurant or a business or, you know, some other kind of creating a job for yourself. So you can see immigrant entrepreneurs punch above their weight class, as we like to say. And that's important because startups are responsible for job growth in the US. So, you know, it's interesting, this narrative that the president, but immigrants are taking our jobs, preceded Trump's campaign. Actually, immigrants create a ton of jobs in the US through their entrepreneurship levels. So we don't only use data to make our case. I don't know if this video will work, but I'm going to give it a try. So give me a second. We also tell stories, and this is the story of an immigrant entrepreneur.
This is the American dream. I founded Echo Labs here in California. We're building new wearable devices, revolutionizing how people work out and get healthy. We're creating jobs, attracting investors. But my American dream has one big problem. I'm not American.
Due to a shortage of visas, PJ is one of countless entrepreneurs who may be deported this year. His company, his jobs, his innovation, gone. Tell Congress, let PJ stay. Fix our immigration system.
So PJ is a French immigrant. We worked with him a couple years ago. Actually, the Let PJ Stay campaign was this big national campaign about high-skilled immigration reform, and he was, in the end, allowed to stay, although it wasn't because he had started a successful tech company and was employing lots of people, American-born and foreign-born, although he was. It was because he won a lottery. So the high-skilled visa, the H-1B visa, there are 65,000 available every year. The window actually opens on April 1st, so this just happened. And PJ's year, I believe it was 233,000 people applied. And because that is way more than the 65,000, our system is to draw names out of a hat, literally. So you find out if you won the lottery, which is insane, of course. And the other piece of the H-1B is that you need an employer to sponsor you. So if you started your own company, you can't sponsor yourself. So in order to apply for the H-1B visa, PJ had to cede just under 50% of his company so that he wasn't technically the owner and his employee, an American, could sponsor him. So obviously this is a system that makes no sense. But it's not just that immigrants are job creators. Immigrants are also, filling gaps in the workforce from industries, healthcare to agriculture to the tech sector. So this is about working age. Immigrants are much more likely to be of working age. That's partly because some immigrants come and then when they retire, they go home. But just in general, immigrants come to America to work. And so 79% of immigrants are working age, 57% of native-born Americans are of working age, and those percentages are changing as baby boomers retire. So this week the president actually said the country is full. I don't know if some of you saw this latest quote, not the worst, but inaccurate. So the country is not full. There's a lot of evidence that the country is not full, and in fact, our aging population has created a couple of new dynamics that immigrants can help address. One is that, of course, we have an aging workforce. We have a lot of people retiring, and so there are a lot of workforce needs in order to keep our economy moving in the right direction. The other thing is that our healthcare needs are changing. So we have an increasingly older population that requires more physicians, but also more home health aides. So at the high-skilled level and at the lower-skilled level, and immigrants are more likely to fill both of those needs. Here in New Jersey, actually, there's a shortage. There are 8 open healthcare jobs for every 1 unemployed healthcare worker, and that's a statistic that exists in various iterations across the country. 39% of your doctors were educated abroad, 31% of your nurses are immigrants, and 48% of your home health aides are immigrants. It's a similar story in agriculture. This is a study that we did in 2011 in North Carolina. It's very hard to find good data on the agriculture industry because so much of the workforce is undocumented. But we did a case study in 2011. There were almost 500,000 unemployed North Carolinians and 6,500 available farm jobs. For any visa, the H-2A agriculture visa, for example, you have to try and hire Americans before you are eligible to get a visa. So you can see 268 of those unemployed North Carolinians applied for the farm jobs. Almost all of them were hired. 163 showed up for the first day of work. 7 completed the growing season. So just in case anybody throws that there are Americans who would do these agriculture jobs, at least, it's just not the case around the country. And agriculture is actually a sector that we work very closely with, and an interesting group of advocates, because this isn't entirely true, but this is true for a lot of them. The agriculture industry and a lot of the farmers who we work with are huge supporters of this administration, except for when it comes to immigration. And so we have some very interesting conversations, but also they can be very effective messengers for us in DC. So here's a quick story for how we tell
My
that.
name is Bernie Teal. Sunburst Farms has been in my family for over 35 years. Last year I had to do something I'd never done before. I destroyed 10 acres of good squash. I wasn't able to find enough workers. The opportunity is there. American families are demanding locally grown vegetables, and I want to provide that to them. So please, tell Congress that we need immigration reform now.
So Bernie is a squash farmer in Lubbock, Texas. He is not the first farmer that I've worked with who every single year destroys acres of fresh, perfectly good crops because there is no labor to harvest them. And increasingly, we've been importing more and more of our food as a country because, in part, of labor shortages on farms, which brings up all kinds of health and safety issues. But what my partners in the agriculture space always say is we either import our labor or we import our food, which is sort of a crude way to look at it, but it really is true. We've been losing market share because of this problem. So this is all just a piece of the story that we try to tell, which is that we have an immigration system from the 60s trying to make it in 2019, and it's really not working. So, as John mentioned, we had racial quotas in the 20s. In the 60s, it was really about reuniting families. None of that really took into account our economic needs. And so for us, when we think about how do we create an immigration system that prioritizes diversity, families, and the economy, that's what we are trying to piece together. And as you might imagine, some countries have managed to do this better than we have. This is just looking at some of the other developed countries. We give out 7% of our visas for economic needs total. These are some of the other developed countries. South Korea gives out 81% of their visas for this reason. United Kingdom, 58%. Germany, 59%. So we are very, very behind. Canada, in particular, has an immigration system that is both very effective in meeting their economic needs and their family needs, and also very, very popular. Canada is obviously very different from us, but we study them a lot and their system and how they have approached this issue because they have an immigration system. They bring in more immigrants per capita on both family basis and employment basis than we do, but it's hugely popular. Canadians are very proud of their immigration system, and they are actively taking advantage of our missteps. So they have this billboard, I don't know if it's still up, but it was up a few years ago in Silicon Valley that literally just said, having trouble getting your H-1B high-skilled visa, come to Canada and you'll have permanent residency. It was like a huge billboard on the side of the highway in Silicon Valley. So they weren't even saying like, we are the best or we are the most innovative. They were just saying, the US is shutting the door. So just come a little bit north and we will happily take you in. Their mistake is our opportunity. So the theory behind NAE, like I said, is essentially that you can use these arguments not only to get better immigration policy, but to break through the politics. But, and John talked about this a little bit, we face a huge challenge, especially today. There's a national backlash against immigrants, and this administration is doing everything that it can to fuel that fire, from shutting down the government over the wall, that now feels like a long time ago, but that's sort of a big deal. Our refugee program is all but shut down at this point, taking away protections for dreamers and temporary protected status holders, and of course, everything that's happening at the border and all of the things that they are doing to exacerbate those problems. And meanwhile, Congress, who really creates the immigration system through legislation, is too gridlocked to act. So how do you break the logjam? And this is sort of what I spend my days thinking about. What I've learned, like I said at the beginning of my talk, is that this doesn't happen in DC. It really does start in communities all around the country committed to solving some of these issues locally where you can, and then bringing those lessons to members of Congress. And so that's the bulk of what we do. I spend a lot of time in DC doing federal advocacy, but we as an organization work in about 85 communities right now, with mayors, with governors, with local chambers of commerce, with other local leaders, thinking about immigrant integration plans for those areas, all under the umbrella of driving economic growth. So that could be anything from establishing an Office of New Americans in a mayor's office to passing a State Dream Act. And we build coalitions, specifically bipartisan coalitions, with people from all stripes. And it has this dual goal of making progress on the ground where we can, and also when it's time to advocate federally, we bring all of these people to DC and we make sure that the members of Congress are hearing from their voters, which is who they actually listen to. So this past election, 40 House Republican seats flipped, and I don't know if any of you had a chance to watch some of the ads that were running across the country, but they were horrendous, very racist, very anti-immigrant. A lot of the Republican candidates fell in line behind what the president was saying, and they lost. The most Republican-leaning district to flip was in Utah's 4th district, which leaned Republican by 13%. No Democrat should have won there statistically. And the Democrat who won was the former mayor of Salt Lake County named Ben McAdams, who ran a completely pro-immigrant campaign. He leaned into it, and that is because for the last 7 years as mayor, he moved forward with an immigrant integration plan and said, this is how we're going to grow Salt Lake County. And we actually, as an organization, helped him do that. He wrote a strategic welcoming plan. He wrote something called the Utah Compact, which was a statement of principles that all of these local leaders from around the state of Utah, including the LDS Church, signed on to, saying, we welcome immigrants and we need a better immigration system. And it's actually in part what led to the Senate's comprehensive immigration bill in 2013. He launched an Office of Immigrant Affairs. He started ethnic food tours around the state that people loved, and he helped celebrate immigrant businesses that were creating jobs. And so when he ran for Congress on this issue, it was not a partisan issue. It wasn't even really a political issue. It was a local issue about his community and about what he had done for Salt Lake County and for the state of Utah. And so that's what we're trying to replicate, and that's what we're trying to show is possible. And he did that in 2018 when everything was swirling in the national debate. So finally, what can you do? Here's a map of some of the places that we're at that I forgot to switch to a couple minutes ago. First is to get informed. If you go to our website, there's a tool. It's also on maptheimpact.org, and you can see how immigrants are contributing to your congressional district, state, industry, nationally. anything you want to know from a data standpoint with lots of stories woven in there as well. When you go to talk to anyone, but particularly your elected officials, go armed with these numbers, because most of them will understand that immigration is hugely important to this country, but they don't know how to talk about it, particularly not in the current conversation. And so starting with, for example, this is how many jobs immigrants create in my district, is a very useful tool for them. And so I encourage you to go check it out and learn about what's happening here in New Jersey. Second, as I said, go talk to your mayor, your member of Congress, call up their offices. I spend about a day a week on the Hill, and they all tell me about the phone calls they receive. Members of Congress are old school. They love the phone. They might not open their emails, but they pay attention to phone calls and to meetings, of course. And that goes for your senators as well. At the state level, you have a very pro-immigrant governor, Governor Murphy, but the state doesn't have an Office of New Americans, which is a dedicated office with some funding and some staff to think about how to tackle these issues in New Jersey and bring that nationally. So if you talk to him, tell him to create one. We are doing that as well. And then support the work that we do. I would be remiss as a leader of a nonprofit if I didn't give one plug for fundraising. We do a lot of work around the country. We are trying to scale it beyond the 85 communities plus DC, and so newamericaneconomy.org, if you are so inclined. We would be very grateful for any support. This is a little bit about what we have on Map the Impact. This is what a district page looks like. So I'm going to end there, and we can do some Q&A if there are any questions. But thank you very much.
So did you guys learn anything tonight? Yeah, it was really terrific. Thank you so much. And that's the kind of programs that NFRPP brings on all kinds of subjects. So stay tuned to us and go to our website and stay tuned to the next programs. We take donations too. Okay, so we're going to open it to a Q&A. And where's our tech guy? Okay, so how would you'd like the people to go to the microphones?
Test.
Okay, so questions? Back there, Rabbi.
We want to get this.
Yeah, hold on for the mic, because then we can hear it on the video that's being made.
Okay, thank you both so much. Amazing. I'm just wondering from both of you how you believe climate change is impacting immigration. As I read that the southern hemisphere is going to need to move into the northern hemisphere due to climate change in the future, and just wanted to ask about that.
Yeah, you want to start? Or?
Well, I think that's a great question. It's also a really perplexing question, considering we have an administration right now that denies climate change, and denies immigration.
It's all about weather.
So it's an interesting thing. Certainly, it's being taken up in the different defense departments in the United States. Right, climate change is a sort of threat to national security. But I think that's real, and certainly people facing different realities with farming and agriculture factors into where they go. And this has been happening, by the way, in this country since the 1990s at least. I mean, one of the reasons why the number of undocumented people begins to really rise is the creation of policies like NAFTA, right? When you have small farmers in Mexico that aren't able to compete with larger agro-businesses and are forced to then relocate north, and not as farmers, but as people that do other jobs they can. But I think the push factors, of the climate change, as well as the violence that people are facing in Honduras on unprecedented levels, those push factors are also a big part of this.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think climate change is actually directly related, I would say, to the border crisis happening right now. There are a couple reasons why, at least from what we can tell right now, which is, limited, but why people are coming, especially over these past few months. And one of them is that, conditions are hotter and it's harder to farm in a lot of these countries. And so thinking about, of course, tackling climate change in the larger sense, but short of that, having funding, foreign aid going towards educational programs that teach people in those countries how to farm in these newer conditions. I mean, that's something that has been brought up before as a way to think about how to mitigate some of those push factors, although I don't think it's something that this administration is taking particularly seriously, but it is one of the big factors pushing people, particularly from Guatemala, Honduras.
Thank you. Recently, on the economic channels, there's been a lot of discussion about a slowing growth rate in the United States, and there's this discussion goes on that, you know, the tax bill gave an artificial spike that is now reducing, and that the economic prospects for growth have become limited. And one of the main tenets of this discussion is that there is fewer people to fill jobs now than there have been. Our economic employment rates are very, very low, and that in fact business is in line with a lot of the discussion that you're talking about in terms of needing more immigration in the United States to fill some of these jobs. So I would imagine that it would be very helpful for you guys to also do a lot of alignment with a number of the economic councils and so on that are starting to deal with the same languaging you are about the need for immigration growth for job filling.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We actually work very closely with a huge business coalition around the country, led by, among others, the Chamber of Commerce, the Business Roundtable, and some of the major companies around the country who are facing open jobs that aren't filled, and so they can't grow. And even in, you know, tougher times than this, that's been true. So, you know, I think as is true across the board, businesses have a lot of different interests, and this one falls, you know, at various priority points for various businesses. But yeah, we have a network of local chambers of commerce who are actually very effective at advocating in their local communities and to their local member of Congress. And we have a formal network of about 55 of them who have raised their hand and said, this is our most important issue, help us figure out how to be the best messengers and how to tackle it locally and nationally. And so we actually held a convening for them last week, which we do every year, that is like 3 days of teaching them about how to handle this in their own local communities and then what they can do at the national level. So right now they want to put out a letter about DACA and TPS holders and make a statement on that. So nationally, that's what they'll be doing next. But that's a great point.
It's also wages, right? I mean, and, you know, of course, the thing that's not being discussed here, but it's important, is that, you know, advocates of, in some of these places, and I'm not going to generalize, but a lot of business people, especially in the agricultural world and construction world, you know, are advocating immigration because it's exploitable labor and it keeps certain costs down, right? And that's something that also needs to be addressed, not just, oh, immigrants come and they should have jobs, but also, you know, they should have well-paying jobs. You know, the jobs that we do have in this country aren't paying enough. You know, young people in their 20s and 30s are facing crippling debt when they're getting out of college, unlike prior generations, and they don't have salaries to be able to pay that off. When I was in Texas as a graduate student, I was worked in an organization that worked with wage theft among immigrant populations, overwhelmingly undocumented people who worked in construction and agriculture. And so that was like another component to this discussion, right, is the economic component. And, oh, you know, Texans get cheaper houses, but, you know, people aren't paid, or their wages are stolen, or not, they're unpaid, and, you know, so that's a big part of this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that, and I also think part of the solution there is, you know, leveling the playing field, for lack of a better term. So if you in construction, for example, which has a high undocumented worker population, the reason, in part, not entirely, but that, you know, contractors or business owners can underpay those workers is because they're undocumented, and so they have no recourse and are scared to come forward in any way. And so that's sort of like a piece of the puzzle in thinking about comprehensive immigration reform and why you should have everybody on an even playing field. But it does affect the consumer. I mean, cheaper houses are a real thing in places like Texas.
How big a push is there in terms of immigration to the United States of what Thomas Friedman and others are very concerned about in terms of seeing the world bifurcated between stable governments and an increasing number of unstable governments that are literally falling apart, who may for brief periods of time turn to autocracy and other forms to survive, but the kinds of things that we're seeing in this hemisphere in terms of Venezuela, in terms of Europe, with in terms of the immigration that they have faced in significant numbers of, and I don't think it's unrelated, brown people coming across the Mediterranean, fleeing governments that have lost control over all kinds of things within their own countries.
Is that a question, or that's a great comment?
Yeah.
No, the question is that becoming a more significant issue? I mean, particularly looking at the migrants from Central America. The governments that they are fleeing are, from a perspective of political science and sociology, failed governments. Are we railing in terms of immigration against the tide in terms of, can you stop people from leaving situations in which their lives, whether it's economic, sociological, cultural, otherwise, are being threatened?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question. I doubt it. I doubt that you can stop people in those kinds of situations from migrating. I mean, I think what we try to think about, and sort of what John talked about at the end of his speech, is how can we create we need to figure out what an asylum system is that can manage this level, and how many immigrants we want to let in. I don't think that it's, we certainly don't advocate for just complete open borders, although, you could think about sort of moral arguments for that, but that doesn't make sense, and we don't have the infrastructure to support it. But like, when you come to claim asylum, you have to first pass a credible fear screening, which the majority of people do, and then you get a court date, which at this point is years in the future, and most people don't, and most people end up getting denied. It's about, I think it's almost 2/3 past the credible fear screening, even now, and then about 14% ultimately pass the asylum claim. And it's very, it's what does having asylum here mean, and what is the threshold for that? And that's a debate that we aren't having right now in the midst of this crisis. And so thinking about what's happening around the world, I think it's all part of a bigger discussion.
Well, it's where the loci of capital are, right? I mean, Germany, Europe is having a very similar discussion here. There's an anxiety around immigration. Saudi Arabia imports a lot of labor from India and Thailand. So there are pools of capital, right, that where global populations are in diasporas, right, and are seasonal workers. Are, they go and they come back, they go, and there's a big back and forth in this whole economy. It's not just go to the United States and stay. It's you go, you come back, you go, you come back. You're caught, you're deported, you go back. I mean, there's a lot of back and forth. But I think definitely it needs to be a discussion about the global economy. I mean, can the United States desire to have the capital that it has and then expect no one to come? Or even expect politically to make arrangements with Honduras or El Salvador or Guatemala to disincentivize people to come when there is just so much money in circulation in this nation. This nation wants that, right? I mean, we don't have we're not slowing that down.
Can I just follow up question? Are there statistics on the economic impact of asylum receivers, refugees, as opposed to those who are more economically motivated by their?
Yeah. So there are on refugees that we have. And basically what happens with refugees is they come here with very little. They start with very little. You get a little bit of assistance when you come here, like 90 days of assistance in most states of, English classes and help finding a job and help with housing. Right, and a small stipend, right. And then you're on your own. And refugees have this amazing trajectory. Almost all within 20 years are then earning at the median or above the median and end up being really, from an economic standpoint, contributing productive members of society. Asylee receivers are, it's harder to quantify the data. We have not been able to do it yet. We haven't gotten access to the data source you would need. So I don't know what those statistics are myself. Yeah.
So I'm just wondering in the current, in the current climate where we are retaining people for so long and so many, I understand, although it was Trump that said it, so I don't know if it's true, that they did increase the number of judges to hear cases. But what about the economics of that? What does that cost us versus integrating people who can't be into the country and getting them a job and all of those things? Do you look at that, and is that an effective policy argument against what's going on?
Against detention?
Yes.
Yeah, there is a lot of work that's been done on alternative detention, which is basically like one thing that's been studied and shown to be relatively effective is for people that are not a threat, don't have a criminal record, not a safety threat, ankle monitoring or monitoring of some sort, release them into the community, they can get jobs and await their court date, which at this point, there's an 800,000 case backlog for asylum seekers right now at the border. So your wait is literally a couple years long. But that has shown to be an effective alternative to detention. It's not something that this administration seems interested in pursuing, at least not right now.
We also have the privatization of detention, of prisons. I mean, we're also, this is connected to the larger privatization of prison in this nation, right? So it can be it can be part of the selling point in places like Tyler, Texas, at least when I was there. You know, this will bring jobs to our community. We'll detain these outsiders, the people that don't belong here, and you don't have to have a college degree to work at a detention center. So it's, I mean, there's a lot of problems with that economics, but it's political. Right. Right.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, but it's a real argument.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I know that it's economically less of a burden on taxpayers to do something like releasing into the community, to have somebody work instead of detaining them, of course. I don't know exactly how the numbers break down. That's a good question. I don't know the answer.
And people pay for things that, you know, like Walmart needs undocumented consumers. I mean, you know, it's not as if they're not adding anything to the economy. They're consuming, they're paying sales tax, and you're not doing that when you're in a detention center.
Most undocumented immigrants actually pay taxes. I mean, you get a fake employment number to work, and so you are in the situation where you are paying taxes, but you're not drawing out anything. So again, from a straight economic standpoint, I mean, it's not a good thing overall, but economically, the sort of like immigrants are a drain, pervasive rhetoric in a lot of ways doesn't hold up.
But the Trump administration is trying to stop, right? It's trying to disincentivize people from coming in large numbers, which is part of the policy on breaking up families, which is new under him. You know, don't come and don't send your children because, you know, we have a zero tolerance. So it's about stopping the tens of thousands.
But it's backfiring completely, in part because smugglers have literally taken out ads in these Central American countries that say, the window is closing, Trump is going to build the wall, and then no one's going to be able to go. So if you ever want to go to the U.S., now's the time, and we will take you. And it's working. I mean, that's one of the huge factors in the surge from the past few months is sort of this irony of, like, all of that rhetoric has made people think, all right, like, now's my chance, I better go. I mean, combined with, of course, horrific conditions.
The more draconian it gets, the more desperate people get.
Right, they think this is it, or else their chance will pass.
Okay, hi. I'll try to be succinct. I came tonight because I really want to try to find a way to wrap my mind around this question and know what to think about it. But I was left with some questions, so I'm going to kind of rattle them off and hope that you can address these. Of course, I'm from an immigrant family. I mean, my grandparents are immigrants. I'm not against immigrants. I just wonder, as a parent who has, watched my children go into thousands of dollars of debt to get through college, and their cohorts looking for decent jobs. Yeah, we know that Americans won't do farm work, but that's the first generation. The next generation won't be doing farm work. They'll be looking for, medium job, middle income jobs. And of course, when you bring people in, it's a whole multi-pronged situation where they need affordable housing, there's a shortage of, health insurance. My daughter is moving to New York City. She's 26. She doesn't have any health insurance. Who's going to take care of her if something happens? Medical care, higher education, lack of good jobs. The H-1 visas. First of all, my husband's in labor. Those construction companies, I don't even think the Texans are getting cheaper homes. The owners are getting more profit. There's a lot of money circulating, you said, but in my perspective, 1% of the population is controlling most of that money. The H-1 visas, we're bringing engineers over from India because they're cheaper. I tried to immigrate to Canada 30 years ago, and let me tell you what their policy is. Maybe it's changed. Maybe they are more embracing now. I was going to join a theater company where I would be basically volunteering and having to raise my own support, okay, from the United States. So they had to advertise throughout Canada to see if anyone else wanted this non-paying volunteer actress job in British Columbia. They're very protective of their jobs. They want to make sure Canadians have a chance to have jobs. It seems like in the old days, what I'm hearing about from older people, there was like a sponsorship system. Somebody would sponsor you over here, and then they would say, yeah, they're going to have a place to live. They're going to work at my, wallpapering company or my butcher shop or whatever. And you and I think even when Vietnam ended, I know our church sponsored people. It's kind of a way of saying, yeah, we're going to make sure they're not a burden and everything's. So I guess I have all these questions about, is it really?
There were lots of questions
There
in there.
are
I can tackle some of those.
Yeah, there are questions in there.
So first of all, thank you for your questions. You make a lot of really good points. The first thing that I want to say is that, and I'm sorry if I portrayed it this way, I am not saying that immigration, and particularly any and all immigration all the time, is a cure-all at all. Certainly not an economic cure-all. There are a lot of tensions that come up when you bring different kinds of people together. You know this, and I think I think there are costs. There are short-term costs, and certainly, if you are an American construction worker, you could lose out to an immigrant construction worker who is undocumented and who can be paid less. That of course happens. There are problems with the H-1B visa system. There are also, immigrants who come, and just like anybody else, their kids go to public schools. Immigrants don't tend to use public services as undocumented immigrants at nearly as high rates as Americans for fear of, being caught. But yes, all of those are true things. I think what we know, and what I was trying to put out there, is that there are some short-term costs, but in the long term, and this has been proven over and over again throughout history, economically at least, immigrants are a huge net benefit across the board to the economy. And the other thing that we know is that we have an immigration system that is totally broken. And so when we're thinking about how do we create an immigration system that works for Americans and for people from around the world who want to come here, those are the things that we need to think about. And like one of the things that we talk about for an ideal immigration system would be something that evaluates the economy each year and thinks about who we should be bringing with what kinds of skill sets, what are the criteria that we should be looking at, and that is not just skill set wise. I think diversity is important, family reunification is important, but these are all things that we need to look at. But net, it is a huge benefit over time, and something that we are, shooting ourselves in the foot with our current system. To your sponsorship question, that is still the system today. So today, the way that you can come in as an immigrant is either by being sponsored by a family member, a close family member, who says you have a place to live and will help you get on your feet, et cetera, or by an employer. So you can't, there really isn't another way to come in unless you are related, if you're a spouse of an immigrant who's coming for a job, you can come, but you can't work for the most part, or if you are a refugee or asylum seeker.
Yeah, and I mean, there's just also moments in our history where it has worked. I mean, in World War II, we needed a lot of labor, and the government, U.S. government, Mexican government got together and created the Bracero program, which brought some 5 million people over between 1942 and 1964. And, that was sort of, and then the U.S. government proceeded to deport a chunk of those people along with their U.S.-born children under a campaign that was called Operation Wetback, no less. But, it's also losing sight of that history in terms of the additive components. I do think, though, that it is really important to scrutinize and not just kind of blanketly say we've always been a nation of immigrants, therefore the border should just be open, and we shouldn't really give that much thought to this. Because the other side of your point is important, too. We want to account for people coming here, and if we're moral about it, we want to also make sure that their livelihoods are cared for. And that does take a judicious border. So thinking about the ways, I mean, I'm really interested in the ways that the discourse works, right? When are immigrants good? When are they bad? And what is the political reasoning for that? And what are the political ends? What are we able to ignore when we're thinking about the threat at the southern border? We're able to ignore gun violence. We're able to ignore the fact that you have children that are unsure of their futures in their 20s, and that they have crippling debt already. We're able to point somewhere else. Is it possible to think about a just immigration system and to have college graduates not have crippling debt? I mean, that would be nice, right? Instead of an either or. I don't see Donald Trump worrying at all about how much money 24-year-olds have, in debt. And so it's not that those are directly connected, but it does shift our radars.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say, and then I think we're about to get kicked off the stage.
Okay,
is that your point, I just say this because it comes up a lot, like your point about like we have 1% of the people in this country who control all of the wealth, and there's a really strong argument that that's true, but is that because of immigration or entirely because of immigration? And I bring that up because that happens a lot with immigration. It was a campaign tactic for President Trump to say, here are all of the economic and cultural anxieties you are feeling, and guess whose fault it is. Like, here's a villain. And I think it's so much more complicated, of course, than that. And so, resisting that kind of thinking, and like John said, like, we need to figure out a way so that we can have an immigration system that works, so that parents and 26-year-olds in New York City, like, have a way to live and afford to go to college and get a good job and have health insurance, and we can bring in people that the country needs and that we want to accept.
I'm going to give a short question, but it's to Hannah. Your organization, I have to admit, I've never heard of before, but now that I have, I'll try and look into it. But I think it's important because you're addressing two issues that we keep hearing. The rhetoric is immigrants are coming here taking our jobs, and you show data that is the opposite. And then the other one that we hear, just this week I heard a person who is very knowledgeable on this issue, who I consider myself an ally of, saying that economic immigrants are here and they're just a drain on the economy. And again, I think you have data that would say that's not true, and the opposite of it. So the challenge I asked of you, and how do you bring this forward? How do you change people's minds on these two key issues? You have data.
Right.
You convinced me, but I don't see how you can convince the majority of the people in the country.
Yeah, it's the fundamental challenge of our organization. For a long time, we were under the radar on purpose. We were doing a lot of work just very, very locally in communities, and frankly, like being an organization in New York City and going to some of these communities around the country, like nobody wanted like a big name, sort of flashy organization coming and telling them what to do. And so it was very helpful in some ways. Now, particularly in the last couple of years, that's exactly what we think about. We have all of this data, we have all these stories, and basically wherever I go, somebody says this, which is like, this makes so much sense, and I've never heard of you before in my life, and I've never seen this data before in my life, and like, who are you? Like, how are you getting this out there? And so, you know, in addition to sort of running around the country and having lots of us who do that, we are thinking a lot. There's a lot of really interesting research about how people change their minds through cultural and artistic activities. So the movies they watch, the TV shows they watch, you know, the books they read, areas that as a sort of traditional political research and advocacy organization we have not gone into. But I just came back from LA meeting with a documentary producer and the agent to a bunch of celebrities, all to try and say, how can I work with you and the platform that you have to reach people that I am not reaching? You know, everybody just being at this event means that you are by definition more interested and informed than the people that I need to reach for the most part. And so, you know, it really is, it's amazing. Like, people who watch crime dramas think that crime is the #1 issue facing this country. It shapes the way that people think about issues, not only what's important, but how they think about it. Now, whether that is like upsetting or just a fact is a different discussion. But
I watch Scandinavian dramas, and so I think
so your priorities are like
the
all over the
Norwegians
place.
are coming.
Yeah.
Terrifying.
So we are trying to think about how to take this information and package it and distribute it in a way that people will hear it. I'll take any suggestions you've got, because.
I have to play with the Norwegians for a second. The raw fish is coming. Two short questions. You said that you had 40% of the Fortune 500 companies that were started by immigrants?
Immigrants or their children.
Or their children, okay. You took the 50s as the start of the civil rights movement, and I would take the 60s?
Rosa Parks. Yeah. But okay, you can. Is that a...
Agree to disagree.
Yeah. Okay.
My brother was active, and he would argue.
Okay.
Okay, so we want to thank our speakers for doing a stupendous job tonight.
Thank you all.
And we want to help them in her efforts to get legislation passed and good policy. And also, we need you to go out and tell your friends and your colleagues and your neighbors what you heard here tonight and any discussions and conversations that you might be able to have. And then I want you to tell them to go to our website where this video will be posted, and they can get the information directly. So we have a lot we can do. Thank you.
Rhoda.
Thank you, Rhoda.
Hi, I just wanted to add a quick word. Tonight was about learning, and we so appreciate having the context and the background and new ways of seeing the immigration issues. If you're inspired to take action, and as Hannah said, talk with legislators, make the connections, share the stories. Reformed Jewish Voice of New Jersey is all about making those connections, and one of our key issues is immigration. It's part of why we co-sponsor tonight. If you'd like to learn more, see me or sign up for our email list, and happy to work together. So thank you so much.